Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today, my guest is James Rogers, a co-founder and director of research at Council on Geostrategy, a newly established think tank in London, Great Britain, dealing with all affairs that make Great Britain and according to the official representation of my guest today, and free world more united, stronger, and greener. Hi, hello.
Hello, good to be with you.
So, just let's get down to the critical issues related to being stronger, more powerful, greener, and more united. Why did you decide to establish the new think tank in London, given the fact that there are quite a few of them in a city, in such a city as London? So what was the motivation behind that?
Yeah, thank you. London's think tank scene is, we might say, rather saturated. There's a whole array of think tanks, some of them going back into the 19th century. In fact, I think one of them is the oldest foreign and defense policy think tank in the world. So we're aware of the nature of the saturated market in a sense. But at the same time, I think we thought the world is becoming a more volatile and competitive place, and that's been outlined quite openly in Britain's latest foreign and defence policy review, the integrated review, and the defence command paper that supports it. And we thought that this was an optimal time to establish a new think tank that looks particularly at Britain's role in the world after Brexit in this more competitive era, and comes up with solutions as to how we can maximise our capability and maximise the strength and unity of what we call free and open nations around the world as they run up against authoritarian competitors in the form of countries such as China and, of course, Russia. And we thought, given the publication of the integrated review and the defence command paper, given the fact that we're now in a post-Brexit environment, and given the fact that we are in this more competitive international order, that we need an organisation that's dedicated to looking at these things and finding optimal solutions for the countries that we're focused on, alongside the UK itself, of course.
So where would you position the interests of Great Britain these days, given the fact that, we have had Brexit, so you are pivoting away from the continental Europe, that you have traditionally been a sort of a bridgehead of the United States influence into the European affairs? Given the fact that the United Kingdom, Great Britain has had a history of, sort of a great leverage on European affairs, in this new great power competition that is unfolding, as you rightly stated, across Eurasia and around Eurasian littoral waters, in those turbulent times that apparently are ahead of us, and that is my understanding that this was the reason why you decided to set up your organization. Where would you see Great Britain? I mean, how would you position and then I will ask you a question, how to navigate towards this position, so to speak.
Yes, I would take issue with some of your assumptions or assertions there. The UK has left the European Union, of course, but I don't think that means that the UK is pivoting away from Europe. In fact, I think that the UK is, in a way, reconfirming its role in Europe. And of course, it's important to point out that membership of the European Union does not equate to a role in Europe. Of course, it's a specific type of role, but the UK considers itself a European power, irrespective of whether or not it's in the European Union. Of course, there's its role in NATO, of which it is one of the most active members or allies. It's one of the biggest supporters of the enhanced forward presence in Eastern Europe, the second biggest defence spender by some margin after the United States, a nuclear weapons state that's pledged to uphold the alliance's security, both formally and informally through parliamentary calculation and discussion. So I don't think it's the case that the UK is pivoting away from Europe. What the UK is doing is repositioning its role, or repositioning itself as a European actor. And I would say in some respects, it's actually consolidating its role, particularly in that NATO context, and also in understanding that Europe, or the Euro-Atlantic region, is no longer a distinct theatre in its own right, but insofar as China, in particular, through its Belt and Road initiatives, and broader foreign policy posture, is moving closer and closer towards the Middle East and to Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, that the Euro-Atlantic region and the Indo-Pacific region are in many ways falling into one another. They are becoming a broader strategic theatre that stretches all the way from the British Isles, if you will, and the North Atlantic to the Northwest Pacific and Japan. And in that context, you have to think about European security also in the context of Indo-Pacific security. So over the weekend, Britain dispatched its super carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth and a strike group composed of several different frigates and destroyers, some of those provided by allies, not least the Netherlands, also assets provided by the United States, warships, warplanes. And that carrier group is now on its maiden operational tour to the Gulf through the Mediterranean. Some ships will separate and head into the Black Sea to uphold Britain's presence there in relation to Russia. It will then go down into the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean first, then down into the South China Sea, up into the Far East, and then of course back again. But this is supposed to demonstrate that European security is not only about the European continent or the European neighborhood, or even the Sahel and the Gulf. It's also now increasingly connected to what's happening much further afield in the Indo-Pacific region, where there are many European financial and economic interests that need to be upheld. And the UK, as a major naval power, has the capability to draw allies together and to uphold a broader presence. Now, in that regard, I think it's also supporting the US role as the kind of global custodian, or the custodian of the open international order. And in that respect, it helps the United States to play that role, because as we know, the US is increasingly focused on the Indo-Pacific region, and will become even more so in the years ahead as China grows in strength and power. And therefore, countries, or particularly US allies, and those with means, whether in their own regions or more globally, have to step up to help fulfill that role. So I think that's something the UK is trying to demonstrate, not only through the deployment of this carrier group and its support to NATO, but also through its defence spending increases that were announced late last year, some 25 or almost 25 billion pounds increase that will be provided over the next 3 to 4 years to modernise and uphold Britain's military capability. So in those areas, I think the UK is trying to reposition itself as a major European actor, of course, but a European actor with extended global interests, and an actor that can demonstrate that Europeans can have that global role and reach, which is increasingly important in a world that is defined by not only intensifying geopolitical competition, but also a broader variety of powers that are in areas of the world that are no longer exclusively the Euro-Atlantic, as we have seen over, let's say, the last 200 to 300 years, where they were primarily all concentrated in Europe or the North Atlantic area.
But that seems to be quite a challenging and very ambitious list of purposes and objectives to achieve. Just even briefly summarizing: global reach towards the Indo-Pacific, still being an active player on the continental affairs, being as you said, the global naval powers, powerful, big naval power, but at the same time cutting expenses on the land force, traditionally, by the way, and still Europe is a land environment. And given the fact that once you have Brexited away, the structure of trade and flows and structures of decision making across your continent is changing, because the power is changing, even if we do not declare that it's changing the structure of power. What is the grand, and if the strategy is about calibrating the resources with ambitions, what is the grand strategy of Great Britain then, these days?
Yeah, I think you have to roll some of these issues together. So you said, for example, that Europe is primarily a land environment, and to some extent that's true, but NATO itself is a maritime alliance primarily. It's about the projection of military and industrial power from North America and the British Isles into the heart of Europe. So in order to achieve that, you have to have control or even command of the sea. And that's particularly the case when you see the modernization of the Russian Navy and the rapid buildup of the Chinese Navy, which is becoming increasingly not only a regional or even an extended regional Navy, but even what the Americans would describe as a blue water Navy. And it's probably only a matter of 5 to 10 years until China can send out large numbers of ships around the world, and many analysts are waiting and watching the build-up of China's logistics fleet in order to be able to facilitate that, as well as potentially overseas naval stations of the kind that the US and Britain have historically operated. So I accept that Europe is a land environment, and to some extent Britain has, it started to recomprise or redevelop its military posture. But the movement has been away from heavy armor of the Cold War variety. But I think many analysts here would say that in any case, even though this will remain important, there are two issues at stake. Firstly, these traditional capabilities are being complemented or even superseded by additional capabilities, whether they are air-based fire support in the form of drones and cyber technologies. But also that European countries themselves that are located in primarily a land environment, whether they are those like Germany, Poland, even to some extent France and Italy, although they of course have maritime perspectives as well, that those allies have to do more in a European context to step up, to provide the kinds of forces that traditionally countries like Britain and the US provided, and even Canada to that extent. But because of the changing geopolitical environment, there's a changing force posture underway, and that Russia in particular is not the country that existed during the Soviet period. It's much, much weaker in many respects, and therefore it should not be beyond the capability of the major European actors, Germany and Poland in this sense specifically, but also to some extent Romania and the Baltic states, as well as Central European countries, to do more in a NATO context to provide those kinds of capabilities that countries like Britain and the US can then support from behind, while simultaneously ensuring command of the ocean in the North Atlantic and the other seas surrounding the European theatre. So you ask what Britain's grand strategy is in that sense. Well, I think Britain's grand strategy is to maintain control of the ocean. After all, the ocean is the main conduit, if you will, or the main platform on which the UK has to operate in order to reach anywhere, including the European continent, despite the fact that there's been a tunnel built between the southeast of England and northern France. So I think that this integrated review and the Defence Command paper does set the UK up to focus primarily on the sea. The Royal Navy and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, the logistics arm of Britain's naval capacity, have been the winners of this review. But I wouldn't go so far as to say necessarily that the Army and the Air Force have been the losers. It's just that the strategic setting in which we're now located is now different to what existed previously, either during the Cold War or even the post-Cold War environment, when counterinsurgency operations and military interventions in far-off lands, whether they be parts of the Balkans or North Africa or the Middle East, or even parts of Central Africa, those have sort of gone out of favour because of the new geopolitical competition, and traditional great power conflict, even if it's in a very different setting, have become more important. So I would say that that's Britain's. If global Britain has a meaning, then it is to play a key role in controlling or commanding the sea. And this, of course, will be done in conjunction with allies like the United States, Japan, even potentially in the future countries like India, which the UK has a growing relationship with and wishes to see an evolving partnership with.
Very interesting, and maybe to your surprise, I concur with all those points in terms of sort of the capacities and rationale. Let me just only add a few comments. It is true that NATO is, at the end of the day, a North Atlantic alliance, which is how you connect between the continents, and true that Great Britain is at the epicenter of that. And you need to project power towards Europe, and that's fully understandable description. So in that context, pardon me for my sensitivity, but I'm seated in Warsaw, landlocked almost into the heartland of Europe, where the Russian land force is the main threat for Poland. That's why we always are very on alert on all, U.S., the Pacific pivoting, changing the structure and so on. But also I concur with you that the battlefield is changing, and we have more and more dispersal and asymmetrical capabilities. Mass is of less importance than capability to disperse and mass at your timing. And I understand that this is the evolution that the last British papers sort of point to, right? So where the forces in the peer or near peer competition should be, and I welcome it in a way, because that finally underlines that the Western armies need to adopt to catch up with China and Russia, which is a shocking argument, but if you analyze how they asymmetrically got prepared for that, to cut through the power projection capabilities from far away, this is what you need. So we welcome it, this development. But also, and I'm navigating towards the question. I have a feeling from your description in terms of the geopolitics, that being located outside of Europe, but on its perimeter, the British Isles, and having U.S. allies, and you mentioned Japan and India and Australia, right, and so on. Aren't you already posturing a little bit your country, your position in the world, to form the expanded Five Eyes alliance to accommodate the U.S. offshore balancing more than being direct on the Eurasian continent, which is again a ringing bell in Warsaw, and it's also elsewhere, because this is what you may assume from your postures, your words, that it's, of course, we would like to keep the world free and open, but given the limited resources, we need to recalibrate, reposition ourselves, and it will be like more those maritime nations or littoral nations of Eurasia within this new sort of alliance, like expanded Five Eyes, that make sure that the world ocean is being the main highway and we control it, and all other things are flexible, like Great Britain did in the 19th century vis-a-vis European affairs, so to speak. How would you comment on that?
I would say that I think there's two elements to this, and we're not moving back. We're not moving back to what we traditionally would have called an offshore balancing role. Britain is not leaving, and the US are not leaving the key region, which of course is this sort of idea of a rimland that stretches all the way from Europe around the southern underbelly of Eurasia, and as I said, up to Japan and South Korea. We're seeing a different posture. So the Cold War period was focused primarily on Europe, and the industrial and military resources of Britain and the United States and Canada were focused on Europe. Of course, the US also had a focus on the Pacific region, and to some extent also the Middle East as well. But the primary focus of the Cold War was Europe. Now, the situation today is very different because, as I said earlier, the geopolitical environment has broadened. It includes many more actors, and more importantly, the relative power of those actors is changing as well. So if you look at the situation in 1945, basically Britain and its empire and the United States accounted for between 70 and 80% of the world's industrial output and the majority of its wealth, because the rest of the world was basically, in complete disarray because of the war. And even during the Cold War, the two major countries, Britain, the United States, also Canada to some extent, accounted for quite a large proportion of global, gross national income and industrial capacity, as well as the military wherewithal of the Western alliances. But that's now changing, and the US and the UK, Canada, even the European countries that were drawn into this system, and Japan, Australia, have accounted for less. But there's no organizational system to bring them together. So the traditional alliances and organizations are no longer, in a way, fit for purpose. They're no longer set up in such a way that support the broader strategic objectives. So we do need to have a degree of reorganization to draw in countries that traditionally were not part of this, or have been somewhat detached, or have had a particular regional focus. We need to reorganize things, to rebuild, to draw together a new system of cooperation and power, if you will, to underwrite a new order, a free and open order that keeps the authoritarians from revising fundamentally the international order or closing off large areas of it under their own domain. And China's continentalization of the South China Sea and broader maritime spaces in that sense are well known, as are Russia's actions in the Black Sea region and the Baltic region, and the broader strategic intent. So the one major issue is firstly to draw together a new combination of power in support of an open international order. Now, where I think this is not moving us back to a traditional offshore balancing role is insofar as countries like the UK and the US are still very committed to upholding an extended deterrent posture to underwrite a broader collective security, or in NATO's sense, collective defense or even collective deterrence. So we've seen no rowing back here really in the forward deployment of British and American military capabilities on the European continent or in other regions as well. So for example, the integrated review states that Britain is going to forward deploy more warships into the Gulf and into Southeast Asia to support an extended British military presence. The US also has a similar agenda. So the forward deployment of these conventional assets or their extension commits us in a way to a role in those strategic environments, which in any case are increasingly connected, that then intersects with our broader military capacity, which in turn is reinforced by our nuclear deterrent. And as you know, the UK and the US there's a great deal of cooperation in those areas as well. So in many respects, I'd say that countries, particularly in NATO on the more exposed eastern flank of the alliance, have never been as secure, because for the first time in history, they have, even though they are in relatively small numbers, they have the extended conventional forces from Britain and the United States, as well as other allies, that are forwardly deployed, which in effect actualize their nuclear deterrent capability. And therefore, if Russia or some other actor were to engage with them or seek to revise borders using force of arms in those regions, then automatically they would come up against potentially British and American resistance. And that, of course, would then lead potentially to escalation that could become uncontrolled. And therefore, it becomes a calculation here, at least on Russia's part, as to the extent to which they're prepared to go there, and how, therefore, would countries like Britain and the United States respond. And I think that leads to a situation where things become entirely unforeseeable or incalculable, which in turn should reinforce the broader deterrent posture.
Let's put aside for this episode the eastern flank, or as we used to say in Poland, Eastern Front, the balance of force and the extended nuclear deterrence, because this is a very detailed issue, and I would like to try to convince you to record another episode, particularly on that, because we would have a lot of questions and some comments to what we have just said. But I really wanted, in this first episode of ours, I wanted to touch on the structural nature of the world today and its transition. And I think in your opening, in your organization's opening paper, you touched on the Crow's memorandum from the beginning of the 20th century. That, as I understand it, ushered in the concept of the freedom of strategic flows, that the maritime power of Great Britain should always be in a position to support the freedom of strategic flows, movement of people, cargo, goods, capital across the world using the smart world ocean highway. And in that respect, it will be serving the interests of its own British interests and, of course, the global interests, so to speak, because otherwise, any friction on freedom of strategic flows, on the world ocean, would create a balancing coalition of your enemies. And in Warsaw, we have been watching the U.S. policy over the last 3 years, and we think that the United States breached the Crow's memorandum in that respect. And that makes a completely different setting than the Soviet-US Cold War rivalry, because China is a major industrial powerhouse, interconnected with the global economy, with huge connectivities, interconnections, deals, interests, and so on, binding the Western social contract to its Chinese interest. So how would you like to, face this challenge, given the fact that China has been rising within the order? And in order to change it, you need to change the order. And we are not sure that all Western nations want to change the order, because some of them profit from the existing order. And this is quite a daunting task. How would you comment and explain all those things to our audience?
Well, yes, that's one of the big sort of strategic questions, and one of the big knots that we've gotten ourselves rather bound into, because of course, in the aftermath of the Cold War, China was still a relatively weak actor. I mean, even in 1997, when Hong Kong reverted to Chinese rule, I think it was the case that Hong Kong accounted for around 25% of China's national economic output, which is phenomenal given that it was just one city among many. Today, it is just one city among many, which is probably why China no longer considers it to be as important as it was in the past. And political considerations then come to the fore in a way that previously they did not. So China back then was a relatively weak country and a relatively inconsequential area of the global economy. But over the last 20 years, at least, that's changed. And as we know, it's changed fundamentally. And as you say, China has profited and prospered in this system that we created in the aftermath, well, even during the Cold War, in the aftermath of the Second World War in many respects. And even the roots of it go back even further, still into the 19th or even the 18th centuries. And Britain in particular, as well as the United States, has played a key role in creating that or developing it. Now, China has prospered, and in a way, a little bit like a cuckoo, has created a good environment for itself, which it has over the last 10 years, or even the last 5 years. It seems to be changing as a result. Now, we believed, or at least we hoped, that China, as it grew into this system and prospered from it, that a large middle class would emerge, and in time there would be political changes in China, maybe incremental, but slowly but surely, that China would become more like us. It would become a more democratic, plural political system. And of course, that may still happen. But at least for the last 5 or 10 years, it seems that China has been going in the opposite direction. It's been becoming more authoritarian, and it's begun to use, it's beginning to draw together state assets and state power in relation to the economy in such a way that it takes us in a way back to I wouldn't say the old-fashioned 19th century world, but to a world where China becomes itself a unique political unit, although closely integrated into the global economy in a way that the Soviet Union was not, but nonetheless a country with specific interests as defined by the regime, which may not be entirely compatible with our interests or with the interests of the broader system as accepted by many different free and open countries. So China seems now to be using its power to close off elements or areas of this system and to take control of them through a number of different ways. One of those ways we've already mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is perhaps a bit of a misterm. What we're thinking here more is sort of like globalization with Chinese characteristics pursued through a very aggressive geo-economic policy to build communication lines and nodes of Chinese influence that spread out from China itself across the length and breadth of Central Eurasia, but also what we now define as the Indo-Pacific region to reach areas of importance to China's economy, whether those be the Middle East or parts of Africa, which China has become increasingly dependent on for manufacturing to gain raw materials and energy for manufacturing to then export to primarily, but no longer exclusively, Western countries that are the ones that tend to be wealthier. So China has now developed into this kind of industrial or manufacturing powerhouse, and in some ways it's made the British and American industrial revolutions in the 19th and 20th centuries look like sideshows, given the speed at which it's occurred and the sheer scale of China with its 1.3 to 1.4 billion people. So, you can see the fruits of this in the enormous systems that China has developed, whether the high-speed railway system, which is now longer and more extensive than the rest of the world's put together, plus 50%, or the construction of the Chinese expressway and motorway networks, which now exceed the German Autobahn network or the US interstate highway system by some margin. And China has become, through this system, through this development, a major economic power, and it now seems to be directing those resources increasingly into its military and particularly its naval modernization programs, which presumably in only a matter of time will tip the balance of power further and further in China's favor. Now, at the same time, we've in many respects taken our eye off the ball because not only have we partaken or we've facilitated China's rise through the offshoring of our manufacturing capability to China, but we've also neglected many of the elements of global power that we traditionally held, whether through infrastructural power, such as the construction of new ports and maritime and terrestrial communication lines, air lines, and even the sheer size of our naval capability. So since the end of the Cold War, countries like Britain and even to some extent the United States, let alone other European countries, have reduced the size of their navy substantially, while countries like China have built them up, and Russia has modernized, for example. So we, in a way, need to have a complete conceptual change in thinking in order to be able to compete with countries like China in the years ahead, and to understand that they may not and probably won't simply integrate into our system, but they have their own interests as defined by the regime or the Communist Party in China, and they'll seek to push back against us. So therefore, what do? Do we simply accept this? Do we hope that it goes away in time, that China becomes more like us? Or do we now begin to say, enough is enough? It is now time for us to develop more assertive, even proactive policies that integrate all dimensions of our power, including our economic power, which since the end of the Cold War, we've sought in a way to separate from the state, separate from the national power base, and therefore begin to push back in a more integrated and holistic way. And that's a decision that I think we still haven't really come to yet, because it's such a knot and it forces us to unravel so many different elements of our policy since the end of the Cold War. That said, I think the US, the British, and the Australian administrations are increasingly aware of the challenge, and it needs to be addressed. So too do the Japanese and a number of other actors in the Indo-Pacific region. But there is a great deal of inertia, there are a great deal of different interests that are bound up in this. And the conceptual apparatus, if you will, that we require in order to confront it, we've been less willing to move towards, because it takes us back to a period that we thought and hoped that we had left and forgotten.
James, if I may address in that way, this is the essence of the problem, because you accurately described the situation that I also pertained to in my question, but you have not given me the remedy. Because this is a daunting task. It's much more complex and complicated and more difficult than containing Soviet Union. That was an easy task compared to the daunting challenge that we face. So, does the British strategic community provide the answer? How to transform the system without alienating some even of your allies like Germany? And Australia and Japan and countries living off China and living off the strategic flows as per Crow Memorandum proposition that live off China, so that you transform the system so that China is contained and changes its behavior, because so far it has not been delivered. Donald Trump was trying, and it's in his specific peculiar way, because he tried to use the geopolitical weight of the United States in this transactional mode. It failed because China turned out to be too powerful. And that was a shock, I think, in DC. And, being locked here in Eurasia, like Poles and Germans, we are looking whether there is a strategic remedy in especially the United States and in Great Britain, how to sort of make this change. How would you say that? How would you like to answer to that?
Yeah, I think it is something that can be met and we can succeed, but it's going to take time to put in place the intellectual concepts and apparatus to deal with it, and also to move away from this idea that we've moved into a distinctively new era. This idea after the end of the Cold War. Some called it, the end of history. I think, Francis Fukuyama's ideas were sometimes misconstrued or misconstructed, maybe even deliberately. The idea is more sophisticated than it's often assumed to be. But nonetheless, I do think there was this movement or this idea after the Cold War, particularly in Europe, deeply entrenched in Europe, that we'd moved into a decidedly new era, where the old ideas, where the nation state, where geopolitics and geostrategy, even geoeconomics, where there was a national role, if you will, for the economy, where all of these ideas were sort of thrown out and jettisoned and thought to be outmoded or old-fashioned, and we moved into a new era of globalization and the market state and the movement away from geopolitics. And there would be an increasing flattening of the world. International institutions would become more important. States would be increasingly hollowed out, and they would become providers of sort of public goods to their citizens. Citizens themselves would become increasingly global in perception and orientation. But this didn't happen, and then we met China and we met Russia, countries that are under the control of authoritarian governments that have very different agendas to our own, and see the world very, very differently. So we've now got to unpick all of that and to work out the parts that we want to keep, and the parts that we need to bring back, if you will, from the past. And I think there's an internal discussion going on here, because it forces us to confront ourselves and to confront our own identity in many respects, and that's incredibly difficult given the sort of historical issues that are at play as well, bound up into our own development and evolution within the West and within Europe as well. But I think it is surmountable. And in order to do that, we need to begin to, in fact, unpick elements of globalization. Not necessarily, to decouple, as one of the phrases that is put, but certainly to start thinking about having strategic autonomy at a national level, or even at sort of not necessarily a global level, but an international level with other like-minded actors. So the British Integrated Review, for example, specifies or outlines the vision of Britain as a scientific superpower, which of course historically it is always, or it is sought to be. Britain's power comes from the fact, besides its relatively open and liberal political culture, from its ability to create new inventions, to dominate science more generally, and to maintain technological ascendancy across the board. And that's also the case for countries like Germany in history and the United States, of course. So we need to ensure that we are at the cutting edge of technology, and all of our national resources are poured into that effort, so that no other country, whether it's China or Russia, can overcome us in that regard. And beyond that, we need to ensure that China is not, or other authoritarian regimes with similar agendas, are not themselves part of our ecosphere to the extent that they can then shape our policy in ways that are fitting their own preferences. And that requires a kind of an overview or an appraisal of our existing, as I said earlier, of our existing organization and alliance infrastructure, to ensure that the countries that have the same vision as us are working together in sync with one another and in a coordinated way, and in a way, of course, that does not benefit our adversaries, both existing and potential. And this requires a fundamental reappraisal of almost everything. And of course, as you said rightly, Donald Trump at least identified part of the problem, or at least the political forces that gave rise to him were in a way forcing the issue onto the agenda in a way that previously they had not. I think the Obama administration was, to some extent, it understood the level of the challenge, but of course the political pieces and the economic pieces were not yet in place. Ditto, the Trump administration tried to deal with some of these issues, certainly identified China as the strategic economic threat that it actually is, but it failed to implement an effective policy in order to overcome the problem. And now, of course, we have the Biden administration trying to do, trying to implement its own policy, but also meeting some obstacles. Because, to be successful, we probably need to implement something not unlike the policy or the strategy that we implemented in the aftermath of the Second World War. That's to say, there needs to be a kind of NATO-like structure in East Asia that's bound to the existing structures in the North Atlantic. And then in turn, there needs to be some kind of economic organization that sits underneath all of that, a bit like the European Union, that helps to facilitate these economic exchanges and the technological exchanges between the like-minded allies. But of course, the scene is so broad, it's almost global. As I said earlier, it's now not so much Indo-Pacific. That idea is already obsolete. We're now living in an Atlantic Pacific age that stretches both sides of the Eurasian landmass and involves a whole array of different actors. And they now need to be coordinated in some ways. But the issue there is that maybe the United States is no longer powerful enough, as it was in the aftermath of the Second World War, with also very strong British support to draw all this into fruition. And on top of that, as you've yourself just identified, the Soviet Union was largely a closed economic space, whereas China is not. It's seeking actively to push into the global economy and to change the global economy into accordance with its own preferences. So that in turn adds an additional layer of complexity. So we're moving into an increasingly dynamic strategic environment, not unlike that Sir I. Crowe identified in the beginning, in the early 20th century. And that leads to additional layers of complexity, which are difficult to not only overcome, but even to think about in a coherent way, particularly when you're facing hostile intent from the part of your adversaries. Having said all of that, to go back to where I started, I don't think it's insurmountable, but it does require really integrated and effective strategic thinking. The only problem there is that until relatively recently, we've been in a very different area in that regard.
Fascinating. Before we end, given because there are always constraints, including the time constraints, I just was making the notes, trying to summarize the propositions that you have outlined in breadth. So that there is, a need for awakening, so to speak. Okay, that we are already in the post Cold War world, and that brings about a lot of consequences. Military consequences like deployments to the Indo-Pacific and understanding the real power, the power politics and the military as a sort of a foreign policy instrument. That there needs to be a talk about the sort of curtailing of freedom of strategic flows, at least in technological domain, scientific domain, and technology will be the domain where this fight will be fought, so to speak. And that could probably, maybe you hinted between the lines, but at least this is what I gather from the debates that I have, that the social contract that West enjoys will be questioned. Because even if we decouple in certain sectors, and we will be in a fierce competition with such a powerhouse like China, we will need to reshore the tailoring, shoemaking, factories, and it's not such a yield-producing occupation. So who will be doing it, right? And maybe our lifestyles will need to change, and that gives a whole of a pressure on the political constituencies and the political system in democracy. So that's a challenge, probably. The value of chain will change with that, and the supply chains will change with that. And so it will be all very volatile and chaotic, as you stated 30 minutes ago. It will not have to be a containment in the Scannon style and Spikeman style of after the Second World War against Soviet Union, because Soviet Union didn't have freedom of strategic flows outside, so it was contained. And right now, the starting point is completely different. China is intermingled with everybody. And there will be a growing competition for modernization model. And that's a real challenge for the Western conviction that the Western model is the best for innovation, for modernization, for providing prosperity for humanity.
Yes.
And this will be critically. And, we need to start thinking that Chinese might really be innovative, because there is this hubris still in our part of the world, in the West, that they are not. And if they are not, so that it's only a matter of time that we will win. I mean, the history has proven that the Chinese can invent. And the last but not least, from your description, please confirm if I properly understood that the global scene is more now than just the Indo-Pacific or Eurasia. It's very global in terms of the power projection capabilities, Atlantic, Pacific, and the space that provides sensors, and also new economy in space. So it will have to be very holistic and complex at the same time. Would you comment on what I said? And that would be, the conclusion of our conversation, which is always too short, by the way.
Yes, yeah, no, I completely, I agree with, I think, almost everything you say here. And the social contract, the domestic dimension of this is also absolutely critical. So, we have been over the last, let's say, 10 years in the West, or at least in the sort of the old core West, which of course is the US, the UK, and a handful of other countries. There has been this sort of very placid, almost defeatist perspective. People have been looking out at China and other countries, seeing the modernization, even in the Gulf, the building of cities like Dubai, these huge skyscrapers springing up all over the place, cities, roads, railways, infrastructure springing up everywhere. And then, you look at London or Philadelphia or Manchester or New York or Chicago, and things, the whole system seems to be running on either Victorian or Edwardian era technology or infrastructure that was built long, long ago. And it all looks very sort of old and tired. And there's a sort of perception that the history is no longer, we're no longer the makers of history. We're merely responding to it. And the social contract has also, as we've seen, been increasingly challenged within countries like the UK and US, with these sort of intersectional movements springing up, people that are disadvantaged by the new sort of globalized economy people that traditionally were the sort of middle class or the sort of upper working class that prospered in the aftermath of the Second World War in the economic and political system of the time, they seem to have been, if not disadvantaged, then they're certainly not prospering to the same degree that they did. So the generation, the millennial generation, for example, is the first that has seen, in some respects, have been unable to get onto the housing ladder or to have things that in the past that their parents would have considered to be relatively normal, even a natural sort of a right as a citizen. So this is a serious problem, which has further led to an internal sort of focus to dampen down some of those issues, which has prevented us from seeing things either holistically or seeing the bigger picture. And that's also a serious challenge. So whatever we do externally to shore ourselves up, to make ourselves more resilient, it has to also include this domestic economic and social sort of element or even foundation to make it overall sort of resilient. And that's a key issue that we have to look at. And I think I also agree with your broader observation that this really isn't like the Cold War capitalized the Cold War with the Soviet Union. This is much more like the early 20th century, where you have a very dynamic strategic environment, and it's all to play for. And even to the extent that that not even democracies. This is the idea after the Cold War that democracies or liberal countries were generally the most prosperous, and there was a direct connection between the capitalist economy, prosperous society, and being a democracy. But we're seeing that this is not necessarily the case, and countries like China with extremely repressive authoritarian regimes are themselves increasingly economically prosperous and have delivered far greater dimensions of economic growth than the established liberal democracies have, which in some cases have been in economic disarray for the last 10 years as a consequence of the financial crisis in 2007/2008. So, I mean, that's a serious issue that really bites into our sort of self-understanding of who we are and what we're successful at. But at the same time, it forces us to compete because it shows us that that everything is actually contingent and it's not preordained, and there's no Western countries have no right to sit at the top of the financial or economic system, and we have to do whatever we must in order to stay there, to deliver the life that our people have come to expect, and in some cases citizens deserve. So therefore the competitive nature of the system forces us to reappraise our understanding, and that in turn is, I hope, what's now happening in countries like the UK and the US.
I think that's a good moment to stop our conversation, of course, with the appetite for more. And I hope that once we have stopped recording, I will convince you to record at least 2 more episodes. But for the time being, thank you very much. My guest today was James Rogers, Counsel on Geostrategy, based in London. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
And you stay with us. Stay tuned to Strategy and Future. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Thank you very much.